So around me, a shoal of 42 rod fry. I can't keep them all though, so how to decide which to keep and which to move on. Hello, my name's Andy. I'm the Ginger Pondkeeper. Welcome to episode 105. So, this episode is going to be about the rudd, and specifically what I'm doing about the stocking. First, some background. Quickly though, so I don't bore longer term subscribers. Back in 2012, my son got a fish tank. He chose native species and we stocked it with 2 carp and 5 rudd. Yep, bit of foreshadowing. 2.5 years later, the fish outgrew the tank and I made a pond in which the fish were happy. So happy in fact that 2 years later the rudd spawned, resulting in 30 fry. Less than a year later, a winter, beast from the East Vale, meant the carp and adult rudd died, but 14 of the rudd survived. Pond was rebuilt, more temperature resistant, in fact better in lots of ways, and I had happy rudd again. So happy that when mature, they spawned just as their parents had. Fast forward to 2023, and a different sort of beast killed my carp, a tench, a crucian carp, and all 14 of the adult rudd. However, the 40 plus rudd fry all survived. A year later, and they're growing and happy. Well, they're not mature enough to have spawned as their grandparents and parents did, but they're doing good. So, all good, except I know that when grown to 10 inches or more, 40 plus rudd will be too many for the pond, as would all the extra food I'd have to feed them with. Now, I don't at the moment actually feed them, which I better explain. So, each group of fry I've had haven't needed me to add food in for them. In fact, I took out about half from the first spawning and kept them in a fish tank, feeding them fry food. The others I left in the pond. After a few weeks, I reunited them and both sets of fry were exactly the same size. My pond, being heavily planted, has a large amount of tiny insects and insect larvae, which, with a fair amount of algae too, means there's a good supply of food for the fry to feast on. At least there was for the first batch, but I've got the impression that the current batch are a little behind growth-wise, and it got me thinking that maybe the pond had plenty of natural food for 14 fry, but maybe not quite enough for over 40. I'm not sure. So, knowing that I couldn't keep them forever, and that maybe they were not thriving now, I decided that I'd thin out the herd, so to speak, a little earlier than planned. Which brings me nicely to the question I asked underwater at the very start of this episode: how to decide which to keep and which to move on, and also how many to keep. The obvious choice would be the largest and healthiest ones, and based on their parents, 14 or thereabouts seems to be a good amount. But I have another consideration. All along, right back to my son's fish tank, the plan for which fish we had was based on them being natural native fish. Now, while rudd definitely develop a bronze colouring as they mature and grow, it's not really the orange hue of shop-bought golden rudd, and when smaller are definitely more silver in colour. However, although the original 5 rudd were golden, the first 14 rudd fry that survived to adulthood had 5 that were silver, and their 40 plus offspring had a similar percentage that were also silver. This meant that I had an easy, or at least easier method to decide which and how many fish to keep. So, armed with the following plan: keep the silver ones as long as not more than 15 of them, and if there is, keep the 15 biggest silver ones, I decided to net the rudd and start the selection process. Before that, I needed to prepare somewhere to house the rudd I wasn't keeping until they moved on, and somewhere to select them in. The latter will just be 2 of my many B&Q orange buckets, although this may have been a problem in hindsight, and for the former I needed my blue temporary pond. The problem with this though was that the last time I used it, I may not have entirely put it away in the best condition. So I first gave it a clean with the power washer and then disinfected it with PP, which I left overnight. After neutralising that with sodium thiosulfate, I drained, then rinsed the pond and refilled it with water from the main pond. Then to netting the rudd, which was pretty easy for a couple of reasons. Firstly, as rudd shoal together, especially when chased, and secondly, while they're good at dodging, they often dodge straight into the net. Once they were all collected and put in the first bucket, the plan was to then separate the golden ones into the 10th pond and the silvers into the second bucket. Pretty straightforward, I thought. Except, either due to being out of the water, or the orange colour of the buckets, or my ageing eyes, but when handling each fish, I couldn't always be sure if they were golden or not. This also wasn't really helped by a few that I thought were silver, also having patches of gold that I hadn't really spotted when viewing them on camera underwater. Some were clearly golden and a few clearly silver, but what followed was me questioning my ability to differentiate between gold and silver, checking them repeatedly, nearly giving the whole thing up numerous times, but finally making a decision and getting my final groupings, mostly successfully. So I ended up with 14 in the silver bucket, which were returned to the pond, and 28 in the golden temporary pond, which is a little surprise for me as I thought there were 42, but I also knew that one had sadly died in the skimmer and one I had somewhat carelessly vacuumed up with the pond vac, a process it didn't survive, so I should have only had 40. But to be honest, I'm not that surprised as they're difficult to count, and for a long time I thought I only had 20 odd. So, job mostly done and mostly successfully, although 2 of the silver ones look suspiciously golden, but I'm not messing about with things now. So, down to 14 hard to spot rudd fry, which I'm hoping will continue to do well and grow and hopefully develop a more natural bronze colour as they mature into adult fish. No doubt they'll be happy and within a couple or 3 years have their own spawning. It'll be interesting to see the colour mix of their fry. Right, to come is an update on the new carp, but first on to another job I've completed this week. I've a 3-stage dechlorinator which I use when topping up the pond. It's probably been a little too long since I changed the cartridges and it was definitely needed. It's a pretty simple job, although there's always one stage I make look harder than it is. Anyway, first off I unscrew each cartridge housing with the tool, empty the water out and remove the cartridges. Once done, it's a case of replacing the old with the new. And then reattaching the housings to the unit, which is the stage I spend more than a little while faffing around with. That eventually done, and it's time to refill the unit, releasing air from each housing as they fill. Then running the system to waste for a few minutes to remove any loose carbon until it runs clear. That's it, and another job ticked off the list. On to the new carp and a little update. So I mentioned in episode 103 that it hadn't eaten much. Maybe a little when I wasn't by the pond, but not that keenly. But through the CCTV and other observations, I noticed that it wasn't really feeding at all. It was certainly showing an interest as food hit the surface and the other carp made a beeline for it. The common would follow them, come to the surface and appear interested, but it hadn't really actually fed. So, as an experiment, I converted some of the floating pellets to sinking ones, which way back when I made a video about, see the link, just to see if the common would more happily feed from the floor of the pond. However, in spite of the smaller mirrors feeding confidently, they always do, the common did a fly or swim by, but didn't actually feed. Anyway, experiment done, I returned to just surface feeding. And over time the common did start to show more interest, but the way it was feeding was a little strange. In contrast to the mirrors, who see the pellets and directly target one or a group of them, the common appeared to just move into the general area where the pellets landed, or where the other fish were feeding, and then just open its mouth, sucking in water, expecting food to follow, irrespective of whether there were pellets close enough or not. Which was a little amusing, to be honest, but also confusing. My only real idea about why it's been doing this was based around where it's been living and obviously feeding for the last 3 to 4 years. On the fish farm, they would have been fed quite high volumes of food, which this video shows. As a result, it may have learnt that feeding was as simple as coming up to the surface with the others and then just gulping in as much as it could and food would follow. With a large volume of food and fish about, there wouldn't be any sense in targeting individual pellets. If true, it may be something it has to unlearn in my pond, especially as currently I'm not feeding huge amounts. So, without directly targeting pellets, it'll probably get less food. In fairness to it, as this video shows, it appears to be catching on, and while an interesting curiosity, it's unlikely to be a long-term issue for it. All is going well with the fish and pond then. The plants are continuing to flourish and the pond is fast returning to its usual look, which I'm very glad about. Well, all good aside from the dirty water pump dying. Again, I seem to go through them about every 1 to 2 years, but that's life when you buy cheaper options, I guess. I'll have a new one soon, in a couple of days, as it's very intrinsic to my pond and filter cleaning, which I'm now firmly into the spring-summer weekly schedules of. And there's not going to be any major changes to my cleaning routines this year, except that I will be doing more from within the pond, which might seem a little strange, but it's actually easier for a number of reasons. Firstly, it's much simpler to get to all the corners and places that even with a vac are hard to get to, and ensure they are properly cleaned. Next, I do need to keep the pump cleared out regularly, and I have to get in the pond to do that. Also, to be honest, it's easier on my back than being leant over the pond. And finally, the fish tend to be more relaxed, counterintuitively, when I'm in the pond rather than when I'm fussing around the side of it. Right, that's this episode done. Thanks very much for watching. I really do appreciate it. If you've liked it, please like. If you're not subscribed, please subscribe. I've had a rush of subscribers lately for me. Thank you very much. Please comment and please share. Anyway, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.